issues such as internationalization of education and in current circumstances, virtual mobility, internationalization of curriculum and faculty, global and regional challenges that universities face, and so on. Today, our experts are Lora Rambli, Associate Director of Knowledge Development and Research, European Association for International Education, and Giorgio Marinoni, Manager of Higher Education and Internationalization, International Association of Universities. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Larisa Taradina, Director for International Education and Cooperation at RANEPA. I will participate in the discussion with our guests, and my colleague, Anna Chernyakhovskaya, the host of RANEPA Expert Talks, will be our moderator. I would also like to mention that here with us are the representatives of Russian universities and higher education organizations who are interested in the current development in internationalization. We're joined today by the colleagues from Moscow, St. Petersburg, Belgorod, Kaliningrad, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, Krasnoyarsk, Ivanovo, Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod, Smolensk, Pskov, and other cities. Dear colleagues, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I would like also to mention that we are broadcasting this meeting live on YouTube. The recording will be available there on YouTube as well. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to Anna. Anna, you are welcome. Anna, can you hear us? Anna should be here. Okay, let's, I will start and ask the first question while Anna trying to be connected. The first question is a little bit probably funny, probably serious, philosophical. Imagine stepping into a time machine and going back to the time before the coronavirus crisis. What could be the universities, what could universities have done differently to minimize the disruption caused by the pandemic? Who wants to start, Laura?
Sure, I'd be very glad to do so, although of course that is, a complicated question. And before I begin, I would like to say that I'm very grateful on behalf of the European Association for International Education to be part of this conversation today. And always such a pleasure to be working alongside Giorgio and the International Association of Universities. So thank you for having us. This question of looking backward in order to look forward is always very intriguing. And of course, it's easy now with 2020 vision in hindsight to try and come up with ways that one could have been better prepared. And there's actually a very cute video that was put out by a comedian in the US of herself speaking to her 3 months younger self about life pre and post coronavirus developments. And of course, it's been a very, very striking change from the before and the after, of course. I think, one of the best ways to think about this is just to think about lessons learned. And among those lessons, what really seems to rise to the surface for many in conversations that I've had with colleagues working in universities across Europe and elsewhere, is that it would have been, of course, a powerful or privileged position to have well-developed emergency plans and protocols in place. So no matter what the emergency that presents itself, having a really clear sense of the ways in which one will respond to those developments and the stakeholders that need to be involved in those conversations. So I think those well-developed emergency planning and protocol questions would be really important. But also, interestingly enough, one can have really good such plans, but now in the testing out of them, discovering gaps in them and challenges that present themselves that weren't expected. So one example of that is, in response to the current crisis, universities have rapidly turned to online everything, online teaching, student engagement, all of that. But in the process are really seeing some grave inequities among staff members with access to hardware and software, among students, etc. So even with good plans, you can discover holes in them. And so I think, again, in hindsight, having a lot of those pieces of information already in hand obviously would have been great. In some of the work that we've been doing in the European context, we ran a study in February and March, a survey of European universities, asking them how they were coping with the COVID-19 crisis. And many of them pointed to spending a lot of time and energy on stakeholder management, communication, and information dissemination, not only giving it out, but seeking it from authorities and from other key partners. And having those kinds of relationships and communication channels already in place, I think would have been very appreciated by institutions moving into this situation. And then the last thing I'll say is that, again, in the lessons learned category, I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the most effective ways to support students in particular, but really everyone in our communities with in terms of their physical and mental well-being. And so having resources in place to address those kinds of critical needs, I'm sure would have been much appreciated. They have been rapidly developed in many cases, but a pre-emergency understanding of those things might have been very helpful. So I'll kind of leave it there with those big ideas.
Giorgio, would you like to add something?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you, Ranepa, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. It's always a pleasure being with you and also being with Laura from the European Association for International Education. We are closely cooperating with them. It's always a pleasure being with such a knowledgeable person. And thank you very much, Laura, for already introducing and saying quite some things I would have said. Just to summarize, very difficult to say, in a way, very easy to say afterwards what could have been done before, much more difficult to do something in advance because nobody was expecting the crisis. But there are some few things I would say higher education institution could have done better in order to have a less disruptive crisis at the moment. One of them was online education. Online education was already out there, but in many higher education institutions was overlooked. Many professors were disregarding online education, thinking that it was lower level quality or not interesting or only for a specific type of learners, maybe for adult learners. The tools were already out there and there was not so much attention. And we see now when higher education institutions were forced to move to online education, they did it in an emergency situation, lacking sometimes the skills and the competencies, especially from the professor side, to teach online. So that's one thing. The second thing which could have done better maybe was to recognize the great inequalities that were out there before the crisis and that the crisis has exposed more. So now the COVID crisis, we really see great problems, and I'm not speaking only about access to technology, for instance, but I'm speaking about inequalities between different countries, between different type of institutions, between different students with the socioeconomic background. So all these kind of things were already existing, but a lot of higher education institutions were not really paying attention to these existing inequalities. And now what we are facing is that these inequalities have grown. But as I said at the beginning, it's easier in a way to say it now when we know that, the consequence of that. I would stop probably here on this point.
Thank you very much. And now, Larisa, would you like to comment on that?
Actually, it's already covered many things, but I want to add, something what it looks like probably not very important on the first view, but it's very important when you are in the situation. I think we should create more fun online activities for students and provide in dorms rooms with a larger fridge. Actually, of course, it was very shocked and very difficult, and the situation became much longer than we expected. But in any case, I think these things will be helpful for those who stay in dorms on campus and so on.
Thank you very much to all. And now let's go to the next questions. We're facing now an exceptional situation, of course, due to this global pandemic, which is lasting longer than we could even predict and imagine a few months ago. So under such conditions and circumstances, what do you think? How may be the internationalization of education realized now, and what has already changed, and what may change in the nearest future? Ladies first, Laura.
I'm glad to jump in, and I know Giorgio has lots of very interesting insights as well. So the first thing I think I want to say is that, without being overly dramatic, I really do think it's fair to say that we are experiencing just an unprecedented crisis. It's a crisis for internationalization, sure, but it's a crisis embedded within all sorts of other crises that are playing out at local levels, national levels, international and global levels. And for internationalization, I think one of the key aspects of all of this is that whether we like it or not, and whether our understanding of internationalization is multifaceted or not, mobility has really been a bedrock activity of our field, and it has been just completely upended by these events of the last 4 to 6 months. So with mobility being so drastically affected, this has had a knock-on effect across all of the things that we call internationalization and the way that it's practiced around the world in large part. So I think that's actually been really an identity crisis for internationalization. Knowing that we're so connected to this mobility agenda, what does it mean now, to have that kind of taken away? Within that, there's a financial crisis for institutions, for countries that may be reliant on big numbers of international students, for individuals who have paid money for an experience and are not getting what they originally anticipated. There's an educational crisis in the sense that if we really believe that internationalization it can play a key role in advancing quality higher education, something is going to be really affected there as well. Political crises, social crises, you name it. This is a really complicated situation. So in all these very fundamental ways, internationalization has been really brought short, I think, by these current developments. And some of the ways that I think, some of the effects of all of this, from my perspective, are that on the one hand, I think there's a heightened sensitivity about the vulnerabilities of internationalization, at least the way that it's practiced around the world in large measure. At the same time, I think there's a really strong reinvigorated commitment to internationalization, because the sense of it being pulled away really makes us appreciate what it has to offer. I do think there's going to be, and there already has been, this short-term and quite dramatic contraction of this global industry of international higher education, and that there's going to be a slow midterm to long-term recovery for it. But I also think that there have been these remarkable displays of commitment, creativity, agility to try and rise to this occasion and figure out ways that we can keep what many of us feel is a very important train moving in the right direction, so that the opportunities that we are giving to students and to faculties and to institutions to engage and enrich one another really are still there. So those are kind of some big picture pieces that I wanted to highlight. I think there's just really been this renegotiated or in process of renegotiating our understanding of mobility and where it fits in and what role it's going to play moving forward. And just a couple of other things about the near future and changes that I might anticipate. I think that we will see, again, more and more happening in this technology-mediated space. Amazing, resources and energies put there. General creativity in programming and engaging with students. What Larissa was saying about, things as simple as trying to find fun ways to engage students online. That's really important, and I think there's going to be a lot more work there. The internationalization at home agenda, I think, is going to get a major boost in lots of ways, and we can talk about that perhaps as a group. And then just the last thing I will say is that this point of caring for ourselves, caring for our students, caring for this field, I think that kind of emotional connection to one another and to what we're doing has always been there. But I think that's really being elevated, and that will be a line of action that will require and will see more emphasis. So a few thoughts to chew on there.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, actually, your words are quite challenging. They are not pessimistic, but I can see optimism, and thank you for that, actually, for that tune of our discussion. That's very important for us, I mean, to realize it, to realize this moment. So, Giorgio, Larissa, who would like to continue? Yes, Giorgio, please go ahead.
Definitely, thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, for outlining very important points. Indeed, I can only agree on the fact that the understanding of internationalization as mainly student mobility has been the most impacted one, and has created huge disruptions and even crises, as mentioned by Laura, financial crisis for education institutions, which were heavily relying on the recruitment of international students. But on the other hand, I would underline also the fact that this crisis is an opportunity to move away from that particular vision of internationalization. So internationalization is much more than recruiting international students, and especially recruiting key-paying international students, which we know had intrinsic problems like the mobility flux from south of the world towards the north of the world, from east to west, with all the consequences like brain drain, unequal sharing of opportunities in different countries, even problems of quality, because in some higher education institutions there was more attention on numbers than on quality of education, and could be a boost for other type of internationalization already mentioned by Laura, for instance, internationalization of the curriculum, internationalization at home, which were maybe overlooked in the past because there was this over-focus on student mobility. I would say something about another important aspect of internationalization that we always underline, but sometimes we forget compared to internationalization on the educational part of internationalization. And I would like to speak about internationalization of research, because here I can see different developments, and we can have the pessimistic and the optimistic view. So there is no doubt that internationalization of research was affected by the crisis, especially traveling, participation in international conference, visiting professors, researchers, going from one lab to another. This was impacted as any type of mobility. And it will last for a while, this disruption, in the sense of returning to more collaboration and possibilities of having really face-to-face conferences, scientific meetings, etc. But on the other hand, we see that we are facing now a global pandemic, and so we are facing a real global challenge. And we realize that try to find national or even local solution to a global problem is ineffective. So the pessimistic view would be that the world of research will shrink, in the sense it will be more national, more local, because each country will try to gather only for its own interest, and so research group will have more difficulties in collaborating. But the optimistic view, it's exactly the opposite, is the sense that we realize that that approach will not bring to solution, actually will just be a repetition of effort and a waste of resources. So we need, right now, we really need much more international cooperation in research if we want to solve global problems. And COVID-19 is just one of the global problems, but we can think about many others. We can think about environmental issues. We can think about other health issues. So I would say that today, this crisis is also a wake-up call for the international scientific communities to realize that maybe there was too much attention on competition, on rankings, on trying to have a lot of articles published for the sake of it, whereas we might go back to a more collaborative work where the real final aim of scientific research is to advance knowledge for the well-being of our societies.
Thank you very much. And well, Larisa, we'll keep going on the issue and developing it, please.
Thank you, Anna. I will mention two practical issues. I think that international offices, experts and researchers are likely to preserve most of their activities online in the future. A lot of them have already appreciated the positive impact from open webinars. Thanks to EIE and IAU seminars, for example, me and my colleagues, we actually meet many experts who we previously was able just to read. And actually, I never participated in such a big number of very useful seminars or webinars or online meetings. So many people prefer to participate in the video conferences more rather than flying from London to Tokyo for a 30 minutes presentation. And of course, such format may leave us without talks on sideline, which is sad, but I believe we can live this through. And the second thing which I was wanted to mention is that is absolutely opposite thing, is that is what is connection to the student mobility. For students, it's absolutely different sport. Physical mobility has a lot of valuable characteristics which is impossible to be moved to online. I talked to some parents in Russia who had planned to send their children to study abroad in September. Most of them decided to take a gap year until physical mobility will be available again, because they don't want their children to spend the entire year or semester in front of the computer. Quite the opposite, they consider studying abroad is a useful experience of independent living in a new country, as well as introduction to a new cultural environment for the children. So I don't think that online interaction will disappear after the pandemic. They will become more frequent than ever before, but we all re-evaluate the significance of personal contacts and the experience of new cultural environment. And I hope that physical mobility will return soon, and virtual mobility will eventually coexist.
Thank you.
Could I say something about those points? Would that be okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I wanted to say that I really appreciate the point about the fact that we've been able to accomplish an incredible amount online with these various trainings and webinars and meetings that we've been able to do in short time, since April, since March, the loss of those one-on-one or sideline conversations is quite real. And I'm anticipating that there will be more and more online events that are really going to try to get at that and try to weave that into the experience. So I think as we think about the innovations and the creativity ahead, I think that's a horizon area that will be very interesting to watch. It may never be quite the same as sharing a coffee, sitting together at a table, as Giorgio, Larissa, and I have done. But there may be, some interesting ways that can be developed over time. And the other thing I wanted to say is the loss of mobility is very real, a physical mobility. But I think there's also a matter of perspective there. So for someone like myself who's been in this field for quite a number of years, I have to say that the circumstances are extremely sad and upsetting, but I am delighted to not be doing quite as much international travel as I had been doing. There's a wear and tear, and there's an environmental impact and all of those things that come with that. So for some of us who were doing a lot of that mobility and are now able to step back and still be doing really constructive things, that opens the door for other people who need that physical mobility more than we to get out there and do that. So I'm just interested in that matter of perspective and really maybe putting our resources toward mobility that's really needed versus mobility that may be a little less necessary with these great new technologies. So just a perspective on that.
Well, Laura, thank you for your openness, actually, and being sincere with us. That's also very important. And I would jump actually on what you've said a little bit earlier on the internationalization at home. What do you think? What can you say?
What I can say is that I would very much defer to colleagues that I think you're going to be having join you in this series, Josh Balin in particular, who is quite an expert on internationalization at home, because I think he'll have amazing insights. But I think in general terms, just as this series of events over the last couple of months blew open the door on testing things out with technology and really forcing people to engage with that, I think the internationalization at home agenda is really also very well positioned to blossom, in this particular moment, because it's a necessity, but it's also a really exciting opportunity to showcase, while you're not on that airplane and you're home here with us, look at all of these different ways that are right at our fingertips for us to be developing skills and competencies and relationships that don't necessarily require that same kind of travel. I agree that the perfect world is some sort of combination of that real world mobility and the distance engagement. But I think internationalization at home is going to have a very particular moment over the next year or two as the situation unfolds.
Thank you. And Giorgio, would you like to add something? What's your experience in this field?
I agree with what Laura said, absolutely. And I would stress once more that this is really the time to promote internationalization at home, and especially internationalization of programs and courses, because it's many years that different voices in the higher education community, including ourselves, are pushing for more internationalization at home and for programs with a more holistic view in the global sense, taking into consideration different type of knowledge than, for instance, the typical Western knowledge that we find in a lot of universities at the moment, especially in countries with a colonial past. But until now, as there was an over-focus on student mobility in internationalization, even if these voices were out there, the internationalization at home, the internationalization of the curriculum agenda was somehow always put at a second level. Whereas right now, it's really the opportunity to put this at the forefront of international higher education. For many reasons. First of all, because we have difficulties in having mobility. Second of all, because we are going to face a financial crisis. and internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum costs much less. I wouldn't say it costs nothing, because there is nothing that costs nothing, but it costs much less than mobility. You need less resources, but you need more time, you need more effort, you need trained professors, you need a discussion that goes sometimes even beyond the higher education community, because you need to discuss also with your local society, you need to discuss even with your government, because you might have pressure from your government to have a specific vision of education, even if this shouldn't happen, because higher education institutions should be independent from political pressure. But we know that the reality in many countries is not that one. But so under that point, specific point of internationalization at home, I would say that we really have this occasion of putting at the forefront, and we have also the occasion with these new technologies, as we are seeing even today, to connect a lot of people from different countries in real time. So we have the possibilities of inventing new ways also to teach in the classroom, connecting with people from the other side of the world, which would have not been possible in normal circumstances.
Thank you very much. But I mean, well, you already also touched this issue. We all know, we just realized it from our from surveys and feedbacks from our professors and teachers, that actually not all academics are ready for online teaching and for all this technology. So what do you think? What are the ways of more effective engagement them in the in teaching and internationalization of the education? What do you think about this? Laura, please.
So indeed, I think there has been a very clear reckoning that faculty members, academic staff have really been thrown into a situation for which they were not prepared, and for which their institutions haven't necessarily set up all of the parameters for success for them. It's really just been an instant request, get something online, it needs to happen now. And I think, in many contexts around the world, even before the push to go online happened, there maybe weren't necessarily a whole lot of programs that trained faculty to be great teachers. It isn't necessarily a given that that kind of training is offered anyway, let alone with a whole series of new demands and new technologies. So clearly, in a more perfect world, the kinds of supports that need to be there are at various levels. So when I think about the engagement of academic staff generally with internationalization, let's say not even in terms of online international teaching and learning, I am put in mind of a project that the EA is currently involved in, which is called Tretья, Systemic University Change Towards Internationalization for Academia. It builds on a previous EU-funded project that was called SUCTI, S-U-C-T-I, Systemic University Change Towards Internationalization. And the focal point of these two projects is indeed that very question of how do we engage people in our institutions with our internationalization strategy, agenda, and activities in ways that really make sense for them and for the institution. And in the Tretья project, we're at a very early stage, but we've just done a series of surveys that will be reported out in a report in September or October, asking both institutions and academic staff to talk about the ways that academic staff engage with internationalization, what could be better, what seems to work, etc. And there are a number of different things that are kind of emerging from that very exploratory research. It's not a big study, it's not getting thousands and thousands of responses by any means, but it's pointing toward this idea that there are individual academics who have a lot going on in their own orbit, a lot of very important responsibilities and a workload, and ways that they are being told that they're going to be evaluated. And all of these things can add up to a strong sense of engagement with internationalization or a less strong engagement. There may be issues of personal interest. There may be issues of communication, how much communication is being shared with academic staff members. Are they being invited into the process? Are they being trained and supported? Are they being rewarded for doing these things? So I think there are lots of different levels and ways that we need to think about good practice when it comes to engaging academic staff in internationalization. And a strong sense that I have is that there are many different ways to approach a good answer to this question. A lot of it has to do with institutional culture and structure. It may be field specific. The way that we do this with chemists may be different than the way we do it with historians. So this is a really complicated and messy answer to your question, but I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done here. But I think it also needs to be very tailored to particular contexts. And I think it really needs to be collaborative. It needs to be the various people who are involved in the situation communicating with one another, understanding why is this important, what's in it for each of us, and then trying to find a way forward that makes sense for that given context. Kind of a big answer, but some key ideas there.
Yeah, but there is, food for thought.
Yeah.
So, Giorgio, would you like to develop it? Yeah, I absolutely agree. I like the last sentence that Laura said. We need more collaboration. And I would even underline the fact that there are already institutions which are skilled in online education. We have open universities. And the communication between traditional brick-and-mortar universities and open universities has probably not been always successful, or maybe sometimes even not existing. Whereas here and now it's a possibility because we have already experts in online teaching, and I think that traditional universities have a lot to learn through collaboration with them, and they can, in a way, train their own staff, and especially their faculties, to have an effective online teaching. But I also agree on the fact that it has to be tailored to the need of the different institutions and even the different faculties. And I'm looking, for instance, at certain type of subject which will never be so effective with a pure online teaching. For instance, if I'm thinking about scientific or technological subjects, you need some practice. I mean, I'm a chemist myself, and I remember when I was going to university, you have a lot of labs, and that one, you need to do it, because otherwise when you will end up in a chemistry lab, if you have never tried to do the things yourself, that will not work. And the same will be for medicine, for instance. I don't think that anybody of us would like to be treated by a physician who has never seen a patient before, so in a way, we really have to find a balance between what is feasible online and what is not feasible online. And this is also an opportunity to be maybe innovative. We could try new ways, but for me, the future is probably what we call blended learning. So we will have online what we can do online, but we still have to be presential for some kind of activities. It will be a little bit the same as what Laura said before for meetings and conferences. We will still need some human interaction. We will still need to meet people at a certain moment. And as also Larissa said, for students, the experience of studying abroad, it's not only the academic part, but you have a lot of human experiences, really being immersed in a different culture in another country. This is not fully possible online. But on the other hand, we were traveling too much, and sometimes for completely useless reasons. And we were spending a lot of time moving from one place to another, maybe for a couple of hour meeting, and that doesn't work. So probably this crisis is really an opportunity to find new ways, even to experiment new ways in order to have a different type of education, which probably will be more a blended education than a purely online or a purely face-to-face education.
Yeah, well, thank you. And let's continue what you just started about talking about virtual mobility, because what are the key specifics of effective virtual mobility, and how can universities develop it, and how can contribute to development? So, Larissa, maybe you will start.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, of course, successful transformation of educational process into online format demands an appropriate university infrastructure. And regarding virtual mobility, I think that preparation and organization for that is extremely labor and time consuming. From university side, it demands significant financial spendings for working on the user-friendly software and technologies. And from teacher side, it requires much more time and efforts on the preparation for these online courses. But if the university faces the problem of organization students' participation in virtual mobility, have to significantly reorganize their usual way of life. Staying in one country, students have to live in different culture, environment, and even in time zone. It's quite difficult for students from Paris to study in Beijing time, and all this adds a psychological challenge for students also. So virtual mobility, in my point of view, it's very interesting idea, and I think that we will have a lot of such type activities in the future. But of course, we will have to do rather big work to make it interesting and successful.
Well, thank you, Larissa. So, colleagues, please continue. Laura?
Sure. So it's very interesting. Every time I start having this conversation in EAU circles, we end up deciding at the very beginning that we have to pause and talk about terminology. It's been brought to my attention several times that some individuals that are well placed in this field often struggle with this term virtual mobility, because in fact, there is no mobility involved if we're talking about it being truly virtual. So that's one challenge. And then the other problem that some people point to is that by using the term virtual, we're kind of minimizing the experience. It's nearly something, it's almost this other thing. When in fact, there is a strong argument to be made that effective, well-designed, well-executed online learning experiences can really produce very impressive results. So there is, good discussion around that starting point of what do we want to call this thing? Is it virtual exchange? Is it virtual learning? Is it online international learning? Online international or intercultural engagement? Some people might say, it's just terminology, but I actually really do think there is something to this idea of articulating what it is we're really talking about. So if we're talking about not being physically mobile across borders, but still engaging and learning internationally, then calling it what it is, I think is important. So I just wanted to plant that little idea. Secondly, I wanted to say that like any other really serious learning endeavor, everything starts with the rationale behind it, the why. What are the learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve with whatever exercise we're going to do? And so I think some of the good practice then that begins to embed itself in that, and I'm not an expert in this area, but like all of you, I'm really soaking up a lot of information and trying to learn as well. really begins with that idea of what are the learning outcomes, what are the, that leads us to then thinking about the activities that will make sense to achieve those outcomes, the potential partners that we may engage in that process, and then at the end, the technology. So often people start the other way around. We have this technology, now let's use it, rather than really thinking through what makes sense here for the learning process. So I think that's just a very important set of framing ideas that more and more of us need to really act on in serious ways. I would reinforce what Larissa has said about this idea of, again, like any serious learning activity, the upfront investment in training staff, in clarifying objectives, in putting a whole framework in place is really vital. I taught in an online or hybrid master's program at Boston College for a couple of years, and we were one of the first programs at my institution to do that, and it really was a fascinating learning curve as an individual, but also as a program, as a department, as an institution, about all of the different things that had to fit together in order for this to really make sense. And as Larissa said, it goes not only from the educational side of things, but to the very basic fundamentals of time zones or the financial implications. At my institution in Boston, in the computer, a registered student was somebody who had also paid health insurance, because the tradition was that you're physically there and you need to have health insurance in case you're sick. But if I'm a student sitting in Italy, I don't need your health insurance. I shouldn't be paying that fee, but I can't register because the system says that this box has to be checked. So, from big to small, things have to fit together and make sense. And that may require some, institutional kinds of changes that may not be so obvious at the beginning as we jump into this work. So those are some of the things that are on my mind. And when it comes to faculty support, just a whole lot of attention to that, as well as a commitment to evaluating and readjusting what we're doing. And I'll give a simple example that isn't set within an institution, but at the EAIE, we piloted for the first time ever an online summit event that we ran in June. And we had 4 sessions over 2 days. And what was completely fascinating was, as we wrapped up one session, we had a quick debrief and we talked about what worked just then in that online experience. What can we tweak and improve so that the end user is just a little smoother, it's better, the learning outcomes are achieved in some kind of better way. So that's a tiny example of what is a much bigger and more complicated discussion about quality assurance in many institutions as well. So that's another investment that would need to be made of time and resource. I'll turn it over to Giorgio to see what he has to say.
Thank you. Giorgio, please.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I agree with what you said at the beginning, like the term virtual mobility sometimes is misleading, and probably collaborative international learning is something more appropriate when we're speaking about this subject. And I agree with you with one point, which is why we do that. I mean, what are the learning outcomes of doing this kind of learning? I would like to stress one thing, which is probably the generation of students that we have right now are already virtually mobile. If we think about, they are digitally native, they probably go on YouTube, Facebook maybe not even because it's for old people right now, other social networks, they are more for young people. They might already connect with people from completely different parts of the world. They are exposed to different cultures, but in a way, they might do it without recognizing it. So instead, if we are planning to have a virtual mobility, it's really thinking about what kind of learning outcomes we want to achieve. If we want to have some specific intercultural learning outcome, what is the critical thinking beyond a simple interaction between two different people. I mean, I can speak with Laura right now, and maybe we learn nothing from each other simply between speaking like this, connecting on internet. But we could think about organizing activities where students are trying to think about why the other person is behaving in a particular way, what is the different approach in solving a problem, for instance. So all of this requires a lot of preparation from teachers. So again, once more, the training of teachers would be fundamental. But we should not forget that we can also learn from the students themselves, because as I said at the beginning, they are already exposed to this interconnected world, this kind of virtual mobility. And so probably we should even think about not a one-way learning experience from the professors to the students as it was in the past, as it is in a frontal classroom. We already have many techniques of flipped classroom, of problem-based learning, and maybe virtual mobility and collaborative online learning, it's another tool where we could try more this type of learning and this technique in order to achieve, as I said before, international learning outcomes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Larisa, I know you have something to add to this issue.
I think Laura was wanted to add something.
Okay.
I think what Giorgio has said here is really important about what students know and what students want. And it's my understanding that the Erasmus Student Network is close to releasing a position paper on virtual exchange. And I think it will be really interesting to hear that perspective and have a greater understanding of what's on their minds and how are they experiencing this and what's their vision for what comes ahead. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, thank you so much. And so I would like to ask you, dear colleagues, about the challenges and issues. Are they, issues brought to the higher education and international higher education globally? Are these issues similar in Europe, Asia, Pacific, North and Latin Americas and Africa? How successfully have the regions adapted to the conditions of the pandemic challenge? So what's your observations and feedback from your different members? Okay, yeah, Giorgio, please.
Maybe this question I'm the most appropriate person to reply to this question, as it's really looking at the global situation, and I'm coming from the International Association of Universities. In a nutshell, the answer would be yes and no. In the sense there are some challenges which are common to all regions of the world, and some other challenges which are more specific to a region or another. First of all, we are still living in an emergency situation. We should not forget this. I mean, all of us here, we are Europeans. So Laura is American, but she's living in Europe. So we are living in Europe. So we are kind of experiencing at the moment a kind of post-peak phase, let me call it like this. So the highest moment of the pandemic has been passed. This does not mean that there will be a second wave maybe later, but we are more in a phase where we are thinking about what will come next. But if we are looking at the global level, and it's just the news of 2 days ago, the World Health Organization clearly stated at the global level, we have not even reached the peak of the pandemic. So we are still in the deep crisis. And the other important point is that this crisis is not developing with the same speed at the same time in the same place. If we are looking at East Asia, they are far ahead even of Europe, in the sense that if you're looking in China or in South Korea, they already had a second wave, and it seems they are passing even the second wave of the pandemic. But if we are looking on the other end, in Africa, the first wave has not arrived even yet, and we don't even know if it will arrive or not. Whereas if we are looking at America, and especially the whole America, North and Latin America, they are really in the peak of the pandemic. So one thing is that some challenges, yes, might be common to different regions of the world, but might not happen at the same time. And this paradoxically is an advantage, because regions of the world which are at which have already experienced a certain phase of the pandemic have experiences which can share to other regions of the world and try to avoid the same mistakes that were done in that specific region. But then, of course, there are also specific challenges of one specific region. If we are thinking about a very simple one, if we are speaking about access to technology, of course, access to technology is not the same in all regions of the world. We know, especially, I follow different webinars and I had discussion with colleagues in Latin America. Access to technology, it's really an issue in Latin America, because a lot of students do not have access to technology, or it's very complicated they have maybe to move out of their own apartment. They have to do kilometers to reach a point where they connect to internet. Or even in Latin America, but also in Africa, majority of people don't have landline connection to technology, but they have mobile phones. But at the moment, a lot of technologies are thought to be used mainly on laptops instead of mobile phones. So, I mean, we see that there are these different challenges, and of course, they need a different solution. So, not to repeat myself, in a nutshell, yes, we have some common challenges, maybe at different times, and the answer would be we can learn from best practice already implemented in one region for another one. And the second one is, yes, we have real specific challenges of one specific region of the world, or even one specific country, and in that case, we need to find specific solution for the specific challenge.
Thank you very much. And so, Laura, could you continue, please?
Sure. I think the twist on this conversation that I might suggest is that, yes, indeed, looking at the situation globally is one thing, but it is to me even interesting to look at the variation in experience within a given region and even within a given country. So that, there really are differences in the ways that higher education is funded or supported that may also translate into different outcomes from this pandemic, or the different kinds of reactions that we've seen. So an example of this might be, in the UK and the US, which have higher education institutions that are highly tuition dependent, quite dependent in many cases, in many programs on international students. The disruption to things there, I think has had different kinds of repercussions than we may have seen across continental Europe in different ways. So I think, context means everything. And as Giorgio said, also the timing of events as well. So there's a lot of complexity across this landscape, and the possible learning that we can do from one another is vital, but there are really unique situations to take into account.
Yeah, well, of course, I have to agree with you. So, and Larissa have more information from our region. So please go ahead, Larissa.
I just want to tell a little bit that what we have in Russia here. We ask our colleagues who registered for this webinar to answer a few questions about challenges the university are facing during the pandemic. And I just will read some of the answers what we received. The emergence of many online services for foreign students, the cancellation of mobility programs for 2020, the pace of language learning has decreased, development of the activities for foreign students who are staying in Russia for summer. During the pandemic, it was impossible to implement the usual recruitment mechanism. Universities helped foreign students to find job opportunities. 20 of respondents doesn't see clear difference between virtual mobility and online education. So this gives us wide perspective for different type of activities, and it looks like we could expect some interesting times on our future transforming and so on. And one more case I was wanted to present is a case of Uzbekistan, a small country from post-Soviet area. So the Uzbekistan quickly returned all of its studying abroad students at the end of January and beginning of February. And this move was not understood firstly, but later it was clearly seen as a wise proactive strategy of Uzbekistan, which helped them to avoid a big influx of the virus. So it's if we discuss it like different situations in different regions and different countries, sometimes we can find some interesting answers and interesting strategies.
Yeah, there is so many challenges for all of us. So and dear colleagues, we have about 10-15 minutes and we have 3 questions in our web chat. So please, who is ready to answer the first question about, yes, Giorgio. Okay.
This question is the one about if online learning contributes to inclusiveness or on the contrary, if it reveals new sides of inequality. Both. For me, the answer is both. It's an opportunity to increase access. It's an opportunity to widen the base of learners. It's an opportunity also, as I said before, to do teaching in a different way. But at the same time, it absolutely reveals inequalities. It reveals inequality in access, but it's not only a matter of technological access, it's also a matter of help that students can have at home. If we are thinking about learning at home with learning at the university, we clearly see that students, we have already some examples, students that are coming from a background, from a higher socioeconomic background, where their parents, for instance, have been at the universities, they have an advantage because even if they are at home, they can ask for help to their parents, they can, in a way, get more knowledge, whereas students who are first learners, who are going to the university for the first time, they cannot have that type of help. Another one, it's about connectivity of students. So if you're thinking about urban with rural areas, for instance, even if the students do not have maybe the help of their parents, but maybe in a urban area can still meet their friends. They have a lot of friends that are going at the university at the same time. They can exchange between themselves. They can help each other. Whereas if we are in rural area, maybe there is a student, even if he has access to technology, maybe he or she is completely alone, so has nobody to ask. So at the same time, it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge because for this above mentioned reason. So we have to think about how to tackle inequality, existing inequality in education. And this is not something that can be done only by higher education institutions. This is important to point out. And here I would like to make an example that I heard from a colleague, from the rector of the University of Campinas in Brazil, because this is a very interesting example. So they realized that the majority of their students didn't have access to internet, but they also realized that they have mobile phones. So they start working with the private sector, and also they open a campaign of donation, which is something absolutely not common in Brazil, because there is not the culture that there is, for instance, in the United States or in the United Kingdom to donate. But they implemented this, something new, in order to have donations and contribution by the private sector in order to provide mobile phones and mobile applications to students to continue learning while the crisis of COVID-19 is going on. And this work. So, this is a kind of example of innovation and collaboration with civil society, with the private sector. So, as I said before, this crisis is also an opportunity to invent new ways, new answers to the problems and the challenges that are facing us.
Yeah, right. You have to be brave and innovative. Yeah, that's for sure. So, yeah, what do you think about this emergence of new geographic directions of international mobility?
I think that's a really fascinating question. And it's certainly a very big picture question that I'm not sure I have a very coherent answer to. I guess it's the potential answer here is yes, because so much has been thrown up in the air with recent developments, and really the perceptions of how countries have responded to this crisis may linger for some time and may really affect the ways that internationally mobile students think about destinations. And, of course, my home country of the United States is front and center in my mind as the poster child for a difficult situation, and a difficult situation being handled not so elegantly, to say the very least. So I do think there could be some really interesting knock-on effects about the perceptions of countries that emerge from this experience. And of course, I think we've been witnessing evolution in these mobility directions and trends anyway over time. And I can only imagine as we look, 3, 5, 7 years down the road, the financial crisis that we're facing, how that's going to evolve, who that will leave with financial resources, to think about mobility, will also be interesting. How countries emerge from that part of the story as well may have an effect on those trends over time. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's completely plausible that we would see some adjustments in those trends.
Yeah. Well, dear colleagues, I've just got a question from Olga Maslennikova, and it sounds like, dear colleagues, thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I would like to ask you the question. At present, many universities think about the safety campus for their students to open the university's doors again. In your opinion, what is safety campus should like after the post-pandemic time? Thank you. Thank you, Olga, for this question.
And I just very quick want to add that Olga, she was a member of the group which visited Boston College a few years ago. So she's like alumni of your center, Laura.
So on that note, I'll jump in, but it is also a loaded question. I've been listening to various conversations about that path toward reopening at different institutions. And in fact, because I still have an affiliation with Boston College, I got one of the emails that was sent out by the leadership of BC recently outlining the plans that that particular campus has for opening its doors again in late August and September. And I think like many other institutions, it is very much a menu of different kinds of strategies to reduce presence in classrooms, to have rotating schedules that kind of keep the population on site small at any one time, a whole new set of protocols that help the institution deal with students who may present illness, options for certain populations to say, look, I need a different situation here, a different accommodation, as we would say, in order to be able to participate. I think this is an unbelievable kind of laboratory of individual choices that institutions are making about their comfort levels, their ability to accommodate different kinds of schedules and formats for having people be physically present, and all of it being very much dependent on the current regulations that are in play, which, as we have seen, can change rather quickly from day to day and week to week. So it is a really unusual and uncertain frontier. And I also do think, as Giorgio has said, from country to country, there may be more or less autonomy that institutions themselves have to make these kinds of decisions, and other places where that's decided on a much higher level and one conforms. So I think it's an extremely interesting experiment or set of experiments that we're about to witness here in August and September and October around the world.
Yeah, well, let's not forget not only about challenges and innovations, but financial contributions and financial expenditures for all that. And actually, one of our questions is about overdependence of some universities from international students. In your opinion, what new strategies may be developed to balance the situation? So, who is ready to face this question? Giorgio, please.
My answer would be they should have thought about it before. No, apart joking. Of course, it will be a huge impact, and here you have two answers probably. You have the market answer. The market answer will be the weaker will die, the stronger will become stronger. So we will assist at closures of some higher education institutions which were relying too much on international student fees, and we will assist at some higher education institutions which are financially stronger, which are maybe able to catch the market share left by the other higher education institution, because I'm convinced that we will have a decrease in student mobility, but will not last forever. I mean, this is a temporary measure, maybe for next fall, maybe for the next academic year, but at a certain moment there will be a vaccine against the coronavirus. So we will go back to a certain point to a certain type of mobility. The other answer, it's not the market answer, but the other answer is again a way of reinventing the type of higher education institution. So try to change completely the financial model from a financial model that is based on fee-paying students in order to find different source of revenues, maybe with more collaborations, maybe looking more at different donors, maybe developing some specific projects that are externally financed. It will not be easy. It's absolutely not easy, because looking at revenues is not easy. There might be mergers. Some higher education institutions will decide to merge, like small higher education institutions which are not able to survive in the present situation. They might decide to merge in order to save costs. There will be restructuring, maybe we are rethinking with some layoff of staff. So it's a complex situation. It depends again country to country, but here I think it depends more on the financial model of higher education institution. If we are thinking about countries like United Kingdom, Australia, United States, where many education institutions are financially dependent by student fees, and especially international student fees, will suffer much more than institutions in continental Europe, where international student fees are a contribution to the finances of higher education institutions, but they are not so fundamental. So the answer is probably, as I said, either there will be a market answer, or there will be restructuring, again, a reinvention of the financial model of some institutions.
I see. Well, I know we are talking, we're tasting the water, but anyway, and we're like in prediction area, but anyway, there is a question for your expectations about the virtual mobility for the coming fall. What do you think about the number of the virtual exchange students? Will it increase comparing to the exchange in the last year?
So I'm willing to take a crack at that. I think it's a really interesting question, because I think the knee-jerk response to this question is, of course. We've seen all of this required drop in mobility and an uptick in the use of technology. Having said that, I actually think it really depends on a number of things. Depends on whether we're talking about credit mobility or degree mobility. those are two very different categories of students with two different sets of interests and aspirations. I think it really does depend on what the mid to longer term expectations are about being able to eventually engage in physical mobility on the heels of that maybe initial virtual exchange, etc. And just as Larissa mentioned initially, a lot of students deciding, I'm just not going to bite at all this year. I'm going to take a step back and see what happens with this global situation, and then make a leap during the next academic year, the following academic year. So I think it's a trickier question to answer than it looks on the surface, and really does depend on these variables that I've mentioned.
Thank you very much. And actually, I mean, as there, like for dessert, we all have this question about, is online education effective? So, Giorgio, it's your turn, please.
It depends. As every type of education, if it is well done, it is effective. If it is not well done, it's not. So, I mean, I think we don't have to think about online education as something completely different from education. We have to think about a different form of providing education. So all the thoughts that we have to do before providing any type of education are exactly the same, being education face-to-face or education online. Yes, online education can be effective, absolutely, but cannot be effective. But the same would be for face-to-face education. We can even think about a professor entering a classroom, reading a book. Is that effective education? No, it's face-to-face, but it's not effective education, because students can do it, can read the book even at home, and they will probably learn more. So it really depends on the preparation of education, and the effectiveness is also due to the capacity of the teacher and the engagement of learners.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Well, dear Laura, dear George, dear Larissa, dear colleagues from the regions who send us questions and who are watching us online, thank you very much for this discussion, for contribution to this discussion. And we can assure you that we will continue our online discussions, let's say online by now, and probably we will go offline later on next year or sometime. And we will share the results, of course, with you. And we would like to be in the loop of your researches and your reports. So, and we will share your reports with our colleagues as well. So, because we all have to work for development of international higher education. So that's our mission. And so all the best, and see you online for now.
Thank you so much. And whether it's online or in person, it's always a pleasure.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody, and looking forward to the next occasion.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laura, Giorgio. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.